So morning everyone. So my name is Kim Tolley and I'm Head of Operations here at Eploy. Been with the organisation for just a little over 3 years. In various guises, joined in the implementation team, then was looking after the Head of Implementation Services role for a while, and very recently in January moved to Head of Operations role. I've got a really diverse background. I'm a HR professional by trade, so very much sat in your chairs and kind of done the similar activities to you. Run a HR shared service centre with starters, leavers, changes, discipline and grievance, absence management, all of that lovely stuff. CIPD qualified and fully paid up member. So something I really kind of push to do, even though it's not something I massively use day to day. It's still really important for me to keep in touch with what's going on in the world and keeping my CPD up to date. I've also had, kind of lots of different interactions with things over the years, including compliance, so everything from fire risk assessment, ISO 9001, 14001, and probably everything in between. So hopefully quite a broad experience base to bring to some of these things for you. Okay, so what I'm going to talk to you about today is how to use data insights in the quest for hiring perfection. So what I'm basically going to be looking at here is actually our recruitment metrics cookbook. What we'll do is we'll drop in the chat shortly, I'll drop a link into this so you can have a look. It is also at the end of the presentation as well. And there'll be a few other things that I'll drop into the chat as we go along. So what I've done first of all is just to actually pick up on some of the aims and objectives that you guys actually mentioned when you registered for the event, kind of what are the key things that you'd like to take away, that you'd like to move forward into the business and things that you can take with you. So I've just pulled a few of those out. So some of these are what are the best metrics for measuring your process effectiveness, nice clear one there. How to use data to anticipate the needs of the business and the future needs of the business. How to prioritise your work in an extremely busy recruitment function. It's all great having lots of lovely data, but if you can't actually figure out what to start with first, that's obviously a key blocker. There's endless amounts of data to track. That's something we live in a modern world of kind of, tons and tons of data, big data. What are the most important things? And I'm really hoping that what I'm going to give you today will help with that. And then a final one here, which was quite an interesting one, particularly at the moment. So Natasha mentioned there about the challenge there of too many applicants. Typically, we've seen in the past, it's not enough applicants to the kind of the right roles. But actually a big shift that we've seen very recently, obviously with COVID, is it's very much a job seekers market at the moment. There are unfortunately lots and lots of people out of work and lots of people applying for jobs. So we are starting to see volumes jump through the roof. And it's actually how can you get to that top talent quicker and also give a really good experience to those candidates, the successful and the unsuccessful, to be able to have a nice, neat process, but an engaged and a real human experience for your candidates.
Oh, Kim, you pop yourself on.
Sorry, apologies, everybody had a little tickle cough there, sorry. So what is hiring perfection? What do we mean by that? So it means many things to different businesses and will mean something very different to each of your organisations. What I've done here is break this down into kind of 5 key pillars, and this is reflected through the recruitment cookbook that we can share with you, to hopefully give some themes to actually follow throughout this presentation, this talk. So first one being is candidate sourcing. It's quite a topical one. This is about measuring and comparing your sourcing channels, where basically best to direct your attention and most importantly at the moment your budget. Budgets are obviously very tight at the moment for pretty much everybody. So obviously knowing where to go to find the best candidates for that type of role is really crucial at the moment. So I think that's probably a #1 kind of priority. Secondly, looking at process efficiency, so spending less time on those kind of menial admin tasks, just doing the do, and spend more time doing the value-added stuff, actually talking to candidates and actually engaging with the candidates directly. Diversity and inclusion, so raising the profile of your recruitment programme with D&I-based metrics, so that's something that we'll have a look at as well. Recruitment KPIs. So we have lots of data around recruitment KPIs, that prove what you're doing, but how do we make those easily digestible, shareable with everybody else to actually demonstrate the value of your hiring strategy and actually how your recruitment team and your recruitment function is actually performing. And then finally, looking at value of hire. So a little bit of quality of hire can kind of dip in here, but actually how do you measure and quantify the value of your hires to your organisation? How do you measure somebody who's, okay, average, or somebody who's a real top performer, or perhaps somebody who's less than satisfactory? And how can we actually measure that? And we'll actually give you a tool to be able to go and do that. So where do we start? So there's obviously, it's a huge subject, and there's only a certain amount of time that we can actually go through some of these bits and bobs this morning. So what I'm going to do is just break this down into a few simple parts. So first of all is design. So effort on careful planning and designing of the process and data gathering will pay off. I can't stress this enough, as somebody who's worked in implementation here at Eploy and also implemented lots of other systems, in an HR role. Actually getting that design is right, even if it is actually just your approach to data. Secondly, how you collect your data. So making sure that you actually get those processes set up correctly will save you a lot of headaches along the way, definitely. So it's all well and good designing a beautiful process, but if you don't set it up correctly to collect that data, you're going to come to the third part of analysing the data and you don't have things quite right. So working on those three principles there of designing, collecting and analysing the data. What I've done here is just given a few hints and tips and a few things to think about for each of these. So the theme, some of them might seem fairly obvious, some of them might not. Very much depends on kind of your approach and kind of your experience with these things. But some things to think about in designing your process is, what do you actually need to know? I often talk to our customers as part of implementations about data. Let's look at the end result. What do you actually need to get out at the end to actually design the process right the way back from the beginning? So you kind of flip it on its head. Thinking about when you'll collect the data and how will you actually process it and analyse it? Is it something you'll do within a system, or is it something that you'll need to take out and combine with other data and push into an external system, maybe something like Business Objects or Power BI? Who actually needs to see that data and how will you actually present it? That's quite a key one. If you're pushing something out into a tool that not everybody has access to, or there's not great tools within that to actually work with the data, what can you do to actually present that data in a meaningful way to the people who need it? And then finally, what resource and or tools do you already have or will you need to be able to facilitate this? I'm a very big advocate of making use of the tools and the resources that you've already got. So I think that can be incredibly valuable to actually take a look at what you've got and actually have a look at the capabilities. And then obviously, if you don't have the right tools, to obviously see what's out there. Next, moving on to the collection. So we would suggest that you would try to do things like use an easily configurable tool so you can make changes when you need. Quite often, and again, we see this with lots of implementations, that you actually design a process, build it, start using it and looking at the data, and you realise you missed something or you need to tweak something slightly. So try and look at tools that can make it very easy for you to change that configuration, change the setup, change how that data is analysed and presented. I'm a big advocate of the next one, so avoiding lots of spreadsheets. Spreadsheets are fantastic, they're a great tool. I'm a massive data geek, I'll hold my hand up. They have a purpose, but try to avoid lots of them. Look at how the technology can actually help you. And that kind of ties in with the next point here about cutting out double handling or even, in triplicates, or many more times. Try to kind of keep things so that you're not, passing data from one system, then into another, then to another, then to another. Try and keep it neat and concise. As I mentioned, what tools do you already have that can work with collecting and collating that data for you? And then the final point is about having one version of the truth, and that's the avoiding the multiple spreadsheets, avoiding the multiple handling of the data. So that if you need to find out what's our candidate sourcing data, you go to one place to collect that, whether it be a system or a spreadsheet or whatever tool that you're using to be able to do that. Cool. And then finally, moving on to analysing the data. So things to consider. So what's important to you? So it's all well and good me sitting here saying that these things are really important, but it's actually what's important to you. Reducing your cost, your advertising cost might be the most important thing to you right now, or it might actually be about improving time to hire and actually getting those people through the door much more quickly. Quite often it's a bit of both or all of them. Next point then, as I mentioned, I'm a bit of a data geek, so I talk about the data talking to me. But what story is the data trying to tell you? Does it back up what your gut feeling is, what you're already thinking, or is it actually telling you something completely different? I would always say interrogate the data. If your gut feeling is one thing and the data tells you otherwise, the data isn't always necessarily correct. There might be a little glitch in the way you've pulled together a metric, for example, and you've measured it slightly differently, and a little tweak might actually reflect what you thought, or maybe not. And if you're not making use of data, think about why you're actually collecting it in the first place. Very much along the lines here of GDPR and kind of the principles of data collection. You need a valid reason to do that. If you're not using it, do you really have a valid reason? So there's some things to think about. Quite often I see in processes when I work with customers, they're doing something because they've always done it. They've asked a question on application because they've always done it. Question actually, what are we using that data for? What value does it give us? Does it improve the candidate experience or your ability to assess the candidate for that role? If not, just think about whether you should be collecting it maybe at all, or whether you collect it in a more appropriate part of the candidate journey. Okay. So what I'm going to do now is actually look at a couple of those kind of the channels that we kind of looked at, the different aspects of how you can actually measure. So within these slides, what I've actually done is broken down some of the detail from the recruitment metric cookbook at kind of a high level, just to show to you. So what I'll do is I'll just run through these, but all of these are reflected actually in that cookbook, and I'll come to that in a moment. So the first one we're looking at here is candidate sourcing. So just an interesting statistic for you. So over 34% of in-house recruitment teams like yourself tell us that they struggle with a lack of recruitment marketing budget. That stat actually came from our candidate attraction report in 2019. The link there at the bottom, and also pop this in the chat for you too. So our candidate attraction survey is something that we run every year, and it's a survey of hundreds of companies across all sectors, all sizes, organisations like yourself, to actually ask questions about what's going on in the market, what's going on in your worlds, and then we share that data back with everybody. We're shortly about to release this year's with a slightly different slant on this year. It's been a very, very different, crazy year for everybody, 2020. So look out for that. We'd really appreciate your contribution to that, and it can give some fantastic insights for you to use as well as some, kind of benchmarks and some really great insights into the the recruitment marketing world. Okay, so what to measure for candidate sourcing? So what we've done here is picked out 5 key things. So the first one is the actual source of the candidate itself. So this is about looking at where's best to actually advertise to find the right candidates. We're also looking then at things like application drop-off rate. So at what point in your journey are you actually losing your candidates? So for example, I'll use Eploy here, but you may have this in your systems. We have something called incomplete applications. That's where a candidate clicks and starts through on an application. And it's a bit like leaving something in your shopping basket at Debenhams or Next or Amazon or something. You might get a little cheeky email just to say, we think you might have forgotten this. Do you want to come back to it? And it'll prompt her to come back. You might lose candidates at that point in the journey, or they might actually start to fill in more of the application and leave it kind of 30% complete, 50% complete. So it's interesting to measure at what point in the journey your candidates are actually dropping off. So you can actually look then, if they're not actually proceeding with the application at all, is the application form too long? If it's after the first page, is your second page too daunting, too longer questions, those kind of things. So it's interesting to look at those rates and actually reflect it back to where in the journey to see if you can troubleshoot where that's going wrong. Next point here is what we call qualified candidates rate. So this is really the ability to compare the quality of the candidates across your sourcing channels, for example, but you could also do that against your different job types, permanent, temporary jobs. And it's about looking at, from all the pot of applications that you get, how many of those do you actually qualify, to use that term, a bit like a salesperson would look at a sales lead and qualify it to suitable lead to follow up. You might qualify candidates to say, actually, yeah, they're great to shortlist, we're going to move them forward, and you can measure that as a rate to see how much, what kind of the qualified candidate's rate is. And then again, you can look at that for different sourcing channels. So it might be, you can look at that from Indeed or Total Jobs, or your own website, and look at different places to see where you're getting improved rates. Then moving on through the recruitment journey, looking at the recruitment funnel and the throughput through that. So this is actually looking at, well, we had 1,000 applications. We moved 800 of them to a shortlist, 600 of them to a telephone interview, 100 to a face-to-face, and we made job offers to 10 people. So, literally a funnel. And that can be really valuable as an insight to understand and predict the volumes in your campaigns. So it might be, if you know that you need to recruit 10 people, for example, you can work back and look back up the funnel and actually look at that, and actually see how many people potentially that you might actually want to, how many applications you need to get in, how many interviews you need to do, and actually, how much time you need to set aside for these things. So just to have a look at this, I'm just going to just show you an example. Apologies, bear with me 1 second. So right, so just showing you here, this is actually a page from our recruitment metrics cookbook here. So in all of these, it's written a little bit tongue-in-cheek as an actual recipe book as such. So what we have here is the ingredients. So what we need here, for example, is a history of the dates when each candidate entered each stage of the recruitment process. We also need to know the total number of candidates that reached each stage of that process. So those are kind of what we need. So when we're looking at the design of the process, we need to look at, do we have the history of the dates, and can we actually look at when each person entered each stage of the process? We've given you the actual recipe. So if you're actually working this out on a spreadsheet or good old pen and paper, there's actually the formula there to do that. And then we've also given you here some presentation tips on how you might actually want to do that. There's lots of commentary. I won't bore you with all of that now, or necessarily the details for each one of these individual kind of metrics, how to measure, etc. But this is all in that cookbook, so you can have a look. So what you can see on this next page here is we've given some more detail if you are an Eploy user, for example, how to do it actually in the system. But you can see it very much gives you this kind of funnel that we can see here in the background. And we can also do things like ratios as well. So actually looking at your ratio of people who come through from application to first interview to second interview to offer. So you can look at it from a funnel perspective, but also, what are your ratios as well? So how likely is somebody to get through to second interview from first interview? So hopefully those kind of things are quite useful. Okay, so coming back to our presentation. So the final point here on candidate sourcing is the application to hire ratio, and actually looking here and actually the advertising effectiveness in essence. Okay, so next one we're going to come along to is measuring the process efficiency. So here, what we're really talking about is the efficiency metrics designed to help you optimize your process, and really looking at bottlenecks. So where is stuff getting stuck in your process, and how can you become more efficient? So a couple of things that we're going to look at here. So the requisition cancellation rate. So this will be, for example, if you've got within your system where a hiring manager, for example, might start to raise a job and then abandon it, or raise a job, you actually advertise it, go and start to source candidates, and then they cancel it because the need has changed. So this is really about looking at where are you spending your time and your money unnecessarily advertising jobs, sourcing candidates. So if you can start to understand what those rates are, you can start to then break it down by what are the hot spots. So is it particular divisions? Is it the retail division or your support centre? Or is it a particular hiring manager? Is it a case of they need a little bit more training? So actually, what are the challenges there? Is there a turnover issue in the team? People handing notice in, changing their minds, those kind of things. Okay. So next one here is looking at time to fill. Now this one is brilliant for planning. So this is all about measuring what the actual length of your recruitment process is. So quite often I used to get asked, if I need to go out and find somebody for this role, how long is it going to take me? Now that can be quite tricky. You can quite often give an estimate, but to give a real accurate one can be quite tough. So in terms of if you're looking for a really niche specialist role, maybe something, really unique IT role or developer role, something like that. That might be longer, and you can look at your previous history of recruiting for those role types to give a really good indicator. Or it might be actually, let's say, a really simple customer service role that you recruit, hundreds of throughout the year, so you can actually demonstrate that that's a much shorter time to fill, to help you and your hiring managers understand the planning process. Time to hire. So just to note, this is something different. So the first one is really about the length of your whole process, whereas time to hire is more about actually the recruitment efficiency. So for example, you can measure time to hire from any points. That's really up to you. The example formulas we've given in the cookbook are very much about suggestions, but ultimately every organisation, and I see this through our implementations here at Eploy, is that is something very different to every organisation. But an example might be looking at the actual time from the application being received to the actual offer acceptance. That's what we kind of tend to refer to as time to hire. Moving on then to time to authorise. So this is really looking if you have authorisation processes, whether they be online or paper-based, is how efficient is that authorisation process. Mentioned the beginning on the left-hand side of this slide about bottlenecks. This is a very, very common bottleneck that I've experienced myself firsthand many times, that you might get through, for example, a first stage of an authorisation super quick. But if you're sending something maybe up to a much more senior level, that might take longer, or it might be actually your first approver, your finance or your HR business partner, for example. They might be struggling for workloads or even a training issue using whatever tools or systems you're using. So it's really good to actually help improve your time to fill and your time to hire is actually pushing out and finding out where those issues are in your authorisation process. Time to offer acceptance, that's really about measuring the efficiency of your offers and your onboarding process. Okay, so moving on to the next slide. So diversity and inclusion. So here, so it's quite often we find one of the top priorities, and this is something that you can really help to raise the profile of your recruitment program, your recruitment strategy. A few things that we suggest here that are really good to look at are your diverse candidates ratio. So this is about comparing a candidate or application data based on D&I info. You can then also look at submitted candidates as a diverse candidates ratio. So actually measure the percentage of candidates that have been shortlisted from the initial application, perhaps through to a shortlist for hiring managers by a particular diversity group. So you could measure that by age group or ethnicity or sexual orientation. So that's a really interesting measure to look at. And then actually looking at those diverse candidates and their conversion ratio. So looking at the measure of the percentage of the candidates who move to the next stage by those same groups. So you might actually look that you see you might have X number of candidates from a particular age group that make it through from initial application to shortlist. This is more looking at then how many of those do you actually convert to interviews, for example. And you might measure that to first interview, and then later to second interview, and then later to offers, etc. So that's the last one there, is measuring the likelihood of a candidate from one of those particular diversity groups being offered the position. So you might be able to say that actually, if we have a male who's 35 to 40, what's the likelihood of him reaching an offer stage from the application? So that's something that you can actually look at and start to predict trends and actually look in terms of where do you need to focus more efforts in terms of your diversity inclusion strategy. Okay, so next one is looking at recruitment KPIs. So this can be quite a tricky one. So actually, how do you prove the value of your hiring strategy? How can you actually prove the performance and actually communicate that in a meaningful and effective way? So there are a few highlights here that we would suggest can be very powerful to do that. So first one is new versus replacement requisitions. So this helps to identify where you're spending your time. Is it on new recruitment for brand new roles, or are you actually spending a lot of time backfilling? For example, if you're spending a lot of time backfilling roles, what is that indicating in terms of your turnover, your employee satisfaction within the organisation, if you have a very high turnover internally? Internal versus external hires is quite a good one too. So are you providing enough opportunities for your existing employees? So if you're seeing a very low internal applicant rate, that might be something to actually consider of whether you're engaging enough with your internal candidates and encouraging them to apply for those opportunities that are also available externally to improve your internal mobility. Offer acceptance rate. This is a great measure for how actually attractive your organisation is, and also how attractive your salary and benefits package is. We all know how frustrating it is. You get candidates to offer stage, they're the perfect candidate, and along comes that inevitable counter offer, and kind of how you look at that. So if you can look at the offer acceptance rate, that can guide you potentially into the likelihood of that happening for a particular role type. But also can help then help you to look at things like the package and your overall offering to candidates to join you. Cost of hire, a very important one here, particularly with kind of the financial pressures in the market at the moment. So, and it's an important return on investment indicator, but particularly for your different sourcing channels. So what's the cost of hire for, something that's perhaps lighter in cost? How effective is that sourcing channel? You might be getting tons of applications, but actually, are you making the hires through those channels? Or is it worth spending a little bit of money and saving a lot of effort and getting better, higher quality candidates through perhaps a niche job board, for example? So that can be really, really valuable to help look at that. And then overall, candidate satisfaction, actually, how can you improve your candidate experience? And we've given some details in the cookbook that talks about measuring things like a net promoter score, and then very open questions to actually ask candidates how the journey could have improved for them. And you might choose to do that just with candidates who've actually been offered a role, but also you might choose to do that for people who've been rejected, maybe at application level if you wish, but we commonly see those things more at people who reach the interview stages to gather feedback. Okay. Finally here, just one more point on the kind of the 5 pillars, so value of hire. So we might know that we've got top performing employees who add value into the business, but how do you actually quantify it? How do you actually measure it? It's a very good question. So what we've got here is actually a link to our hire value calculator, our value of hire calculator, which can actually help you with those. You need some very, very simple pieces of information, such as what's the salary of the candidate, what's your turnover, things like, kind of on a star rating, like on a 1 to 10, how much, what kind of like value, how good is that candidate? What's your kind of evaluation of that candidate? Are they average, like 5 stars, or are they absolute top performer 10? That's something really good, I think, to have a look at to help you kind of evaluate your value of hire. So final couple of bits then. So a little bit on objectives. So now we know the kind of things that we want to measure. We go away and measure them, but we know we need to improve them. How do we actually set objectives to improve here? Apologies if you've been to some of these events before, but it does sound like a broken record, but I strongly believe in this principle of making your objectives smart. It pays, it really does pay off in the long run. So just a little bit on that. So hopefully, just to bring that up, I appreciate that some of the there's different kind of models out there where some of the definitions of these are ever so slightly different, but the principles are the same. So I look to make sure things are specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. So a very common one we get asked here at Eploy is, I want to improve our time to hire. So looking at that, is that really a smart objective? It's really not. So it's none of those things that are down there on the left. So just a few hints. So what we've done here is I've actually turned this into a smart objective. So we'd like to reduce our time to hire. We've got that part, but within then being specific, saying that it's actually across the retail division. It's actually measurable because we know that it's going to be within our retail division as well. That's kind of one of the parts that we can measure. It's achievable. That's something that obviously you will be able to gauge within your organisation. Is it relevant to what we're doing? And is it time bound? So for example, we've said here that we want to reduce it to 14 days. That's where we're getting a little bit more of the specific and the measurable. And the fact that it's time bound, we've given ourselves almost like a deadline to do that by March next year. What we've also done here is actually added a little bit of a definition into the objectives itself. absolutely no harm in that. That can be really valuable to actually, rather than having them listed separately, what are the definitions, actually dropping it within the objective itself can be really quite useful. Okay, so that's the end of the presentation there. So what you've got there is the link to the Recruitment Metrics Cookbook that I've mentioned throughout. It's a really, really powerful tool, and it's something, like I said, that you don't need to be a user of Eploy. If you are, you've got some more detail about how to actually use it in the system. But the kind of the base formulas, the principles, the kind of things to think about, and how you actually measure those things, as at least at the start of a 10, are there for you in that great ebook. So yeah, if you'd like to go and download that, that's available on that link there for you. That's it for my presentation. So if anybody has any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them.